Here's a great example of a subject the media whitewashes thoroughly. There's just enough reporting on it that folks who follow the issue know about it, but the reporting is typically so sparse that most people in North America aren't even aware of the conflict. The Washington Post reports on a defiant Al-Qaeda. Over the past year, a shadow war between Al-Qaeda and local Yemeni fighters has intensified, largely out of sight and out of the headlines. While much attention has been paid to a separate Yemeni civil war pitting northern rebels against the internationally recognized government, the battle being waged by U.S.-backed Yemeni forces against Al-Qaeda militants has escalated. In the first year of President Trump's term, the United States conducted far more airstrikes against Al-Qaeda militants in Yemen than it had in previous years. While the pace so far this year has slowed significantly, it remains well above the rate of President Barack Obama's administration. U.S. Special Forces are on the ground here, advising the anti-Al-Qaeda fighters and calling in American airstrikes, a role that has grown as the air campaign has escalated. Pentagon officials have said this effort is successfully rolling back Al-Qaeda's franchise in Yemen, considered to be the militant group's most lethal affiliate. But while the militants have been expelled from some of their strongholds, Yemeni forces acknowledge that their recent gains against Al-Qaeda are precarious. Yemeni fighters combating the group in the hinterlands of Shabwa and Abyan provinces say Al-Qaeda has weathered this pounding and remains a fierce opponent. In recent months, militants have pressed their campaign of hit-and-run attacks and strategic retreats, and have carried out a wave of bombings and assassinations, targeting government officials, security forces, and others. So Yemen is full of Al-Qaeda affiliates, and now apparently ISIS affiliates as well. We've been involved with a bombing campaign, boots on the ground, and the supplying of weapons to our allies in the region for years now, both under Obama and Trump. Why is this? Are all Muslim countries prone to this type of violence, or is something else at play? Is this more complex? Is this geopolitical? And what is this civil war that the Washington Post alludes to in its article? Well, to briefly describe it, the current conflict began right around the time of the Arab Spring that the West heavily supported throughout the Middle East. As in many other countries, the Arab Spring shifted rapidly from protests for democracy to radicalized militias literally going to war with their respective governments. Often these militias were composed of Sunni insurgents who were currently receiving, or had in the past received, support and funding from Western nations and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia being the home of Sunni extremism, called Salafism, or the more extreme form called Wahhabism, thank you very much, Al-Wahhab. In the case of Yemen, the insurgents were Shia, and called themselves Houthis. They still call themselves Houthis. They followed the leadership of former Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had originally held office in Yemen from 1990 to 2012. The ironic thing about this was that Saleh, while in office, used American military hardware from the Obama administration that was specifically earmarked for fighting Al-Qaeda to fight the Houthis. Foreign Policy reports, years of U.S. diplomatic cables show Yemen's President Ali Abdullah Saleh unswervingly determined to get more war material and cash from the United States. In some meetings, Saleh pushes the United States to join the fight against Yemen's northern Houthi rebels, directly with gifts of helicopters, aircraft, and armored vehicles. In others, Saleh asks for specific weapons, but pledges not to use them against the Houthis. "We won't use the helicopters in Saida, I promise, only against Al-Qaeda," Saleh told U.S. General David Petraeus in a January 2009 meeting. Saleh made his pledge, apparently unsolicited, in reference to a northern Yemen city that is the base of a regional rebellion led by the country's Houthi Shiite dissidents. In a September 2009 session with White House counterterrorism advisor John Brennan, Saleh, frustrated, presses the United States to give armored vehicles, airplanes, and ambulances specifically to his campaign against the Houthi rebels. The Houthis are your enemies too, Saleh tells Brennan. Well, politics does make for strange bedfellows. These Houthis, now allied with their former opponent, took control of major Yemeni cities and caused the collapse of the existing government at the time. Prime Minister Mohammed Basin Dawa resigned, General Ali Mohsen al-Ammar fled to Saudi Arabia, new Prime Minister Khaled Baha resigned, and President Abdrabbuh Mansur Hadi resigned and fled. I'm sure I butchered those names, and I apologize for that. The Houthis placed Saleh back in power and allowed the existing parliament to remain as an attempt at compromise and power sharing. In 2015, the United States and Great Britain pushed Saudi Arabia to launch an intervention in Yemen. This began with airstrikes and a naval blockade, with the stated goal of restoring Hadi's government to power. The Saudi armed forces were not remotely prepared for such a prolonged war, and Western nations, specifically the United States, sold them enormous amounts of military hardware in order to facilitate this war. A 2017 UNICEF report stated that nearly 500,000 underage children in Yemen were on the verge of starvation, and about 7 million people were facing acute food shortages. In 2016, the UN stated that in Yemen, almost 7.5 million children needed medical care, and 370,000 children were on the verge of starvation. In 2017, the New York Times reported on Yemen as well. It's a slow death, the world's worst humanitarian crisis. After 2.5 years of war, little is functioning in Yemen. Repeated bombings have crippled bridges, hospitals, and factories. Many doctors and civil servants have gone unpaid for more than a year. Malnutrition and poor sanitation have made the Middle Eastern country vulnerable to diseases that most of the world has confined to the history books. In just 3 months, cholera has killed nearly 2,000 people and infected more than 500,000, one of the world's largest outbreaks in the past 50 years. It's a slow death, said Yaqub al-Jaifi, a Yemeni soldier who has not collected a salary in 8 months, and whose 6-year-old daughter, Shaima, was being treated for malnutrition at a clinic in the Yemeni capital, Sana'a. Since the family's savings run out, they had lived mostly off milk and yogurt from the neighbors. But that was not enough to keep his daughter healthy, and her skin went pale as she grew thin. Like more than half of Yemenis, the family did not have immediate access to a working medical center, so Mr. Jaifi borrowed money from friends and relatives to take his daughter to the capital. "We're just waiting for doom or for a breakthrough from heaven," he said. How did a country in a region with such great wealth fall so far and so fast into crisis? Well, that's a really good question. But it's one that our media will either ask and then obfuscate about, or one that they'll simply ignore altogether. Just take a look at the magnitude of this cholera outbreak. There are almost 1 million people infected. Millions more are starving to death as we speak. If you watch CNN, on one of the few occasions that they even touch this subject, this is portrayed as nothing more than a third world country falling apart with no distinguishable cause. We just assume that because it's a Middle Eastern country, it's uncivilized and naturally exists in a state of permanent horror. But of course, this is not true at all. So, how did a country in a region with such great wealth fall so far and so fast into crisis? The quick and easy explanation is that, we bombed them. A lot. A lot basically means until they had almost no functional civilization left. In March 2015, Saudi Arabia and a coalition of Arab nations launched a military campaign aimed at pushing back the Houthis and restoring the government. Okay, sure. There are some nominal contributions from other countries, but the primary actors are Saudi Arabia, the ones that we always credit with leading the war, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States, conspicuously absent from many of the articles, including this one by the New York Times, until a blurb at the end. We also have a fair number of Blackwater guys in there. What are they calling themselves now? They went by XE Services for a while, and then they were Academy? Is that what they are now, or is it Constellus? I'm not sure. The United States is also a major donor, as well as a primary supplier of arms to the members of the Saudi-led coalition. Although the United States is not directly involved in the conflict, it has provided military support to the Saudi-led coalition, and Yemenis have often found the remnants of American-made munitions in the ruins left by deadly airstrikes. This is about as truthful as the article gets to our culpability. The US, along with countries like Canada and the UK, of the three, only the UK openly debates this issue in government. These countries, we have basically provided the entirety of the weapons used by the Saudis. The American military chooses all Saudi targets. We have special forces on the ground calling in attacks. We guide them to their destinations. We refuel them en route. We've even fired missiles from offshore ships into civilian neighborhoods. Plus, we've been running drone strikes in Yemen since 2011. After all, Anwar al-Awlaki, a U.S. citizen, was killed by a drone strike in 2011 in Yemen. And his daughter was killed in Trump's first ordered raid. But that's another kettle of fish. We sold the Saudis illegal weapons, cluster bombs, white phosphorus munitions. We sold them by the boatload to use in Yemen. And use them they have. We helped them destroy agriculture, fishing villages, markets, schools, hospitals, airports, seaports, until the country began to collapse. We've also blockaded their ports, the ones that remain, and this deprives the entire country of food. This is why they're plunging the civilian population into starvation. This was all ostensibly done to prevent the Houthis, who we like to call Iranian proxies, from taking power, despite the fact that they are aligned with the previous Yemeni government. This is partly how a country with so much wealth falls so far. But how does a massive Shia movement inside Yemen lead to a second shadow war against newly empowered Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates? Well, an obvious point to make is that when Yemen's basic industries were destroyed by Saudi and American siege warfare, people turned to organizations that could provide them with a semblance of safety and the provision of food and resources. Having American-made ordnance destroying hospitals, schools, markets, and food sources, it sure doesn't win hearts and minds. Not to mention that when American-made cluster bombs sitting undetonated in the ground, just waiting to be triggered like landmines, when these blow children up as they're walking down the street, that's a pretty big motivator against the U.S.-Saudi coalition. It makes sense that the longer this goes on, the worse it gets, the stronger ACAP's recruiting power becomes. But that doesn't explain why Al-Qaeda was in Yemen well before the Houthi uprising. Where did the Sunni jihadists come from? Well, it's a dirty little secret that's being whitewashed like crazy. To get an idea of what I mean, let's check in with General David Petraeus. But this isn't a new idea. Arming radical Sunni organizations is an American strategy, and it harkens back to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan during the Cold War. During the Soviet occupation, the CIA armed, trained, funded, and built tunnel complexes for groups of mujahideen that eventually became both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The legacy of this strategy has rippled out throughout history, affecting even those who are unaware it even ever happened. We're sending kids to war today that have no idea how this started or why. They've known nothing but the war in Afghanistan their entire lives. ACAP in Yemen is a direct successor to Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Stanford University does an excellent job of chronicling the different Islamic militant groups throughout recent history, who they interacted with, and how they developed into what we see today. I'll do another video that delves a little bit deeper into this history. It is truly fascinating stuff. So the United States and its Saudi proxies are fighting the current Houthi-backed Yemeni government, as well as a massive militant organization that was originally empowered by the West, and were committing war crimes against millions of civilians to accomplish this. All of that will slowly be swept under the carpet, and will pretend to have humanitarianism at heart as new business opportunities emerge in Yemen. Realpolitik and so-called pragmatism, it's being served piping hot. Remember though, karma lies in wait for those who play games with the lives of others.
If you enjoyed this production by the State of Opportunity, please like and subscribe. Remember, you're the ones who make this all possible. You can also check out our Facebook page at Opportunity State and follow us on Twitter at @OfByOpportunity. If you feel like chipping in a couple bucks, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/stateofopportunity. Have a great day, and remember to always keep an open mind.